All right, everyone. We are live, and today I'm joined by Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be talking about From Jesus to Simon Magus, how Christianity began. So we're going to be examining Dr. Price's views on this today. Before we get started on the topic, Bob, can you tell everybody what's going on with your car and a little bit about the GoFundMe?
Yeah, basically nothing's going on with the car. It went defunct just as I was driving off of the exit ramp from the highway a couple of days ago. And I just had work done on the engine, and I knew I would need more done when I could afford it, but I didn't expect it to just die right there. And then I found out from the last mechanic who had worked on it that a new engine, which I would need, would cost something like $17,000. And I thought, I never expected that, nor can I meet that standard. So what I'm apparently going to do is to buy a used car, which is how I got this one, and it's served me well for many years. But I'm going to go spend less than half, I think, than what I would have on that new engine on a new car. And I hope that'll be wrapped up in a few days. But Jacob has very kindly, for the second time, set up a GoFundMe for little old me, for which I'm eternally grateful. And if you care to and are able to kick in anything, I'll certainly appreciate it. If you can't, look, things are tough. I know that. But if you can, sure would be good to help a Bible geek out. But nonetheless, I posted the link on my Facebook page, and I guess you can go from there.
And the link is also in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment, and it will also be posted on the community tab soon after the show is over. It's also pinned in the live chat as well. So at the top of the live chat, you can click on that link if you want to donate. All right. So, Bob, people think that the typical thing people think of is, okay, there was a historical Jesus. He died. Christianity, as we know it, became what it eventually did after his death. But you have a different take on it, and you involve Simon Magus in it. You involve Paul in it to the degree that Paul is Simon Magus from your point of view. Can you explain that further to the audience?
Yeah, one preliminary thing that I think is important, apologists who sort of think they're historians but are not, say that, well, what's the big mystery? Christianity started when Jesus died and rose from the dead and unleashed the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, emboldening the disciples to spread out all over the known world and preach the gospel and so on. Well, the big problem with that is not historical reasoning. They try to make it appear to be, but the problem is the principle of analogy. You can't just assimilate a supernaturalist claim of a miracle. I mean, that is a classic God of the gaps gambit. How did we get from the crucifixion to the triumph of Christianity? Well, it must have been that Jesus was raised from the dead. And then there are attempts to shave that down a bit and say, well, we don't really know what happened, but at least we know that the disciples believed they saw Jesus raised from the dead. I'm not so sure even that is well established. The stories we have of these Easter encounters with the risen Jesus all seem to contradict one another. And in their contradictions, they leave clear signs that in many cases one has rewritten the one before it, and you just don't have real evidence for that. But the old-time rationalists, for their other faults, did understand this, that if you're talking about real historical method, you can't posit a miracle where natural law ceases to operate. They realized that, well, if we have reason to believe that Jesus was crucified and that disciples saw him afterward, well, it must be that he wasn't dead. He survived the cross. People did occasionally. And so that it's what Schleiermacher called the second life of the Redeemer, but he understood it as a natural continuation after a crisis of the first life. Well, would an optimal historical theory like that, I mean, it put forth with only natural causation, why is that preferable to just acceding to the claims of apologists to say, what, you don't believe that there's a God who can do anything? You don't believe miracles are possible? That if there's a God, all things are possible for him? Well, that's just the problem. You can't start out with a belief in a supposed cause that itself has no empirical basis. You have to go by the principle of analogy, which is not, as critics claim, a surrender to a naturalistic, non-supernaturalist worldview. They don't understand what Hume and Bultmann said about this. They didn't say they know somehow metaphysically that there are no miracles, there never have been any, and so we can just rule that out a priori. That's not their point. If you look at it carefully, they're saying that maybe an inexplicable, in natural terms, event did happen and maybe a God caused it. But can you deem that probable? Well, you cannot, because to what that is attested widely does this correspond? To what that we can rely upon is this analogous? And I always like to use the kind of silly but I think effective analogy. So somebody comes in from a hard day's work, drops down into his easy chair and turns on the TV, and it starts from where it was from the last person that watched it. And the first thing the tired man sees is an astonishing scene of giant reptilian colossus crushing buildings underfoot as crowds of people flee hysterically. What would the viewer immediately conclude? What channel is he watching? What sort of a broadcast? Would he think, holy mackerel, this is real news? How did this monster survive? No, you wouldn't think you're watching the news channel. You would say, oh, I know what this is. This is just like all these Godzilla and Gorgo movies I've seen. Yeah, this is what happens in those movies. Thank God nothing like that has ever been known to happen in the real world. Well, now, do you absolutely know it's not a newscast? Well, you got to wait till the commercial and network ID, and that'll settle it, I guess. But you don't absolutely know it, but it's a pretty safe bet, because what you're seeing is by no means analogous to any event any person has ever recorded as actually seeing. Oh yeah, I had to leave everything behind, and I just escaped with my life from that building that Godzilla crashed. No, of course not. But you've seen plenty of movies like it. So by analogy, it's far more probable that you're just watching a Toho Studios kaiju flick. Well, it's the same way here. You have a story where a guy is dead, really dead, as the Munchkin mayor said, certifiably, verifiably dead. But then a couple of days later, he's raised from the dead miraculously. Now, is there anything in our experience that would fit that? I mean, yeah, there are people who were resuscitated on the operating table, but even Christian theologians say that's not what the resurrection of Jesus is about. It's a guy who was really dead and is brought back to life miraculously. So there's nothing really that corresponds to that. Now, if you could find somebody dead on the battlefield and bring the corpse back, and then a couple of days later, when you're about to bury him, say, oh my God, this guy's alive and his wounds are gone, etc. If there were any events like that on record, you might have to take a second look at the resurrection story, but there aren't, and you can't. And so what does it look like? A number of legends and myths where Hercules and various others are miraculously brought back to life. And one last thing about this is not metaphysical or philosophical atheism. It's not some arrogant atheist saying, well, I know there's no God, that's silly. So naturally, whatever happened here with Jesus, it can't have been a miracle. No, it's not that. Like, I don't pretend to know what is possible and what is impossible in the great wide universe. How the heck can I know? But that doesn't matter. The principle of analogy tells me this is by all means almost certain, but only probability. It's highly probable this has to be a legend like all the other ones. There's nobody going around saying, oh, there was a real Hercules and he died and was taken up to Olympus and so on. There was a real Attis who bled to death, but he came back to life. There was a real Tammuz and Osiris, etc., etc. No, nobody else even says that. They know their myths. So it's simply a question of what can be deemed probable as having happened. You can't really verify it. It's way too late for that unless you've got a time machine in the garage. So the thing is, if you're going to approach this as a historical question, miracles just do not figure into it. Now, if there was a miracle, we're missing out. But then again, why think that there was? Well, that's where it really gets spooky. And people, if they're honest, will finally admit, well, I guess I know it by faith. What does that mean? Are you like Rudolf Steiner, who had some psychic way of scanning the Akashic records and seeing the past? Oh, darned if he didn't rise from the dead. You're kidding yourself. That's not history. That's just gullibility. Even if it happened, right? My point is you have no right to say that it probably or certainly did. So if we're going to look at the origin of Christianity, you can't just say it's the bomb crater left by the miracle of the resurrection. Nope. It may be the bomb crater for some event, but what was it? It has to be something explicable in natural terms, or we're just believing in mythology. Okay, now what did lead to it? Well, I favor mythicism, the idea that Jesus was no more a truly historical character than Hercules, Attis, Tammuz, Osiris, Baal, and so forth. The story is basically the same. The divine hero is done away with by his enemies, and holy women come mourning to look after the body, and they're surprised to see that the god has risen from the dead, or maybe they do something like anointing him that makes him rise. Variations on the theme. The Jesus version is so much like that. Again, this is what it's analogous to, far more than to anything else. So I think that it's mythic. Well, what about all the other stuff in the Gospels? Isn't that a historical record? Problem is, that's filled with miracles too. Now, I grant that several of the things Jesus is shown doing, healing especially, or exorcising, you can see things like that happening in certain churches even today. There are faith healers. There are exorcists like Bob Larson, for instance. No doubt if things like that happened in the ancient world too. But were they real miracles? Well, it undermines, maybe they were, but there's no necessity to think so, since the ones we see up close do seem to be explicable as epileptic fits and psychosomatic uh, illnesses that can be, sometimes you can talk people out of them. So that's pretty iffy, but the depiction of Jesus as a miracle working Superman who heals virtually everybody that comes asking for a miracle. It even says in summary statements, huge crowds of the sick came to Jesus and he healed all of them. Now, I dare say there is no historical parallel to that. That's really a kind of Superman story. And then walking on the water. Are there really any reports of anybody defying gravity like that? I don't think so. There are tricksters, like there are some TM propagandists that claim they can levitate, but it looks like trick photography, and so on. And the thing that really sold me on mythicism as the most likely theory about Jesus was that if you look carefully, as many New Testament scholars have in the last couple of decades, if you look carefully at the gospel stories, every one of them is so similar in one way or another to an Old Testament story of Moses, Joshua, David, Elijah, Elisha, etc., miraculously multiplying food, rising into heaven, raising people from the dead, etc. And not just what they did, but even the details of the story are so similar. You've got to ask yourself now, what's more likely? That somebody defied the laws of nature in a repeated way, like Superman does, or that religious people simply transferred well-known Bible stories to the resume of a guru that they believed in. Well, if they believed in him, doesn't that imply he existed? Well, not necessarily. It's just that they had this dying and rising God, like the mystery religions did, and people began to embroider him with a biography, a hagiography, with all sorts of miracles, like Pythagoras and others, Apollonius of Tyana. And it seems to me every bit of the thing can be more plausibly explained as simply rewrites and borrowings. And it's not that I think it would be better if there were no Jesus, that I would like it better if there was not a historical Jesus. In fact, I have great regard for the Jesus character of the Gospels, very inspiring. And it seems to me that the challenge of faith is when somebody reads the gospel and reads the challenges of this hero to take up the cross and follow him and all of that stuff. You understand what's being asked of you. Do you really need to know for sure who originally said that? Was it a miracle working divine savior, or was it a talented spiritual writer? We can never know. And it doesn't matter because the text says what it says. Do you have to be convinced of miracles before you'll take the Sermon on the Mount seriously? Is that the only way it makes sense to you? I don't think so. If you had all the healings, but you had just the Sermon on the Mount, suppose it said, "Thou shalt stand on thy head for 5 hours every other Tuesday." Would that seem to you to be a good thing to do? Oh, the guy that said it is the Son of God. You'd realize this is a lot of nonsense, but that's not the kind of thing it says, right? What it does say touches the conscience, whoever you are. So it's not a question. You can't prove that you ought to turn the other cheek or what, or forgive someone just because someone can convince you that the guy that said it rose from the dead. That's grossly mixed up thinking. So I tend to think there was a growing faith in a savior who was built on the model of all these other dying and rising saviors, or simply was a mutation of one of those gods. In fact, there is reason to believe that way back in ancient Israel, Yahweh or Jehovah himself was understood as a dying and rising God. I think it likely that the Jesus of the Gospels was originally understood to be an angelophany, the angel of Yahweh who appeared on earth sporadically in the Old Testament. Maybe they believed that this guy must have been that. Who knows? Maybe since the name Jesus means Yahweh is Savior, that would kind of fit. And it could be an epithet given to Osiris, who was certainly familiar to Jews, or Tammuz, or the others. I mean, they were even mentioned in the Bible. So I'll be quiet soon, but I think basically it's not that hard to say a new mystery religion or a new form of a mystery religion took hold. It had much to commend it in its ethics, etc. And the courage its martyrs displayed, and it grew rapidly among Gentiles and assimilating Jews in the Roman Empire. It had many good things going for it, so no surprise that it caught on and grew. Then Simon Magus is yet another aspect of it, which I can also get into, but that's probably enough of a big bite to start out with in terms of anybody's questions or whatever. If I can clarify that, probably needs it.
So when do you see the Jesus tradition start growing? Like, when does it start becoming a text? And what is Marcion's connection to it?
Well, I personally think, and I was pleased to see that the great Marcus Vincent thought the same thing after I proposed it to him. I don't mean he got the idea from me or I got it from him, but I said, "What do you think about this?" Oh, yeah, that's what I think. Namely, that Marcion didn't have any gospel stories about Jesus. And of course, he didn't think the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, were a Christian work. They didn't predict Jesus or any of that stuff. He repudiated that Christian view, and he didn't think the Hebrew scriptures were defective or bad. It's not like he thought they were the satanic Bible or something. He said, "Oh no, the God of the Jews is a righteous God, a little short on compassion sometimes, but not evil." And the scripture he inspired, the laws he gave to the Jews, they're not insidious, they're not wicked in any way, but that's not Christianity. Christianity, they have a belief in a coming nationalistic Messiah who will exalt them and give them dominion. No doubt they're right. Marcion said their Messiah will come, sure, that'll be fine with me. But that's not what Jesus was. Jesus was the emissary of another God who had remained secret until Jesus came along to reveal him, which you might find actually if you take another look at passages like in Matthew 11. Oh, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, thank you that you have hidden these things from the wise and sophisticated and revealed them to babes. No one knows the Father except the Son, and any to whom the Son will reveal him. Wait a minute. Marcion says, how could he say, if he's talking about the Hebrew God being his father, he'd never say that. Plenty of people knew that God. Or in the Gospel of John, no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father. Now he has revealed him. What? Isaiah, Moses, these people never, Nadab and Abihu, Aaron, they never saw God. What about Deuteronomy? Moses saw God face to face like a man talking to his best friend. How could he be referring to that? And so Marcion said, no, Jesus came to reveal a new forgiving God who was all about forgiving, not judging. When Jehovah judged sinners, he was well within his rights to do so. He wasn't a sadist, he wasn't a tyrant, but he was merciless. He was no softy when it came to justice. But the Father of Jesus was willing to declare universal amnesty. And so Jesus gave his life somehow to purchase the right of adoption for his Father to make the creatures of the Creator his own children. He said, well, all right, I'll go along with that. And so he thought of two gods and two different chosen peoples. And he didn't think the Jews were going to hell, anything like that. No, they've got a good enough religion. It's just not Christianity. I mean, Christians don't necessarily think that Judaism and Islam are it's like Satanism or something. No, it's just not Christianity. And it's a different thing. Why confuse them? And that was Marcion's view. So what did he do with the Old Testament? I'm finally getting back to that. There was a lot in it he liked, a lot of these stories, but they weren't Christian scripture until he could rewrite them and make them about Jesus, which is why he sounds so much like Moses, Elijah, Elisha, etc. And so he rewrote a lot of these stories and made them and thus created the first Jesus narrative. It's interesting that second century Christian writers occasionally quote gospel sayings. Not real often, but they do. But they never quote any stories. Why would that be? Well, it makes sense if they didn't exist yet. And that was the contribution of Marcion. So I think Marcion had an awful lot to do with Christianity starting. One last thing, though. In the Gospel of Mark, which must be based on Marcionism, you've got this unrelenting criticism of the disciples of Jesus. It's no reader can miss the fact that they're always foils for Jesus. They never understand what he's talking about. And he's impatient with them. He says, how long do I have to put up with you? What, you don't understand the parable? How are you going to understand any parable I tell, etc., etc.? Well, Marcion said, you see, these guys just couldn't see beyond their inherited Judaism. They couldn't see this was a new thing. And that's where Paul comes in. Nobody has ever been able to explain what the need for Paul was if the 12 disciples were appointed to go Christianize the world. Of course, they weren't. Even in the New Testament, people misread Matthew 28 as if it were a mission charge to the 12, because they're the story characters who stand for the readers of Matthew's gospel, who are Jewish Christian missionaries, probably in Antioch. But the original singular apostle to the Gentiles was Paul. Well, he comes in from left field, and I think that he was Simon Magus. And this gets into a yet more complicated thing as to how he briefly joined them, as we have stated in Galatians, where Paul went to Jerusalem to set forth his gospel for the hopeful approval of the pillars, James and John and Cephas, and how it eventually fell apart. I think that preserves a temporary alignment of Paul or Simon with the Jerusalem church that did not last. And so Gentile Christianity was Paulinism or Simonianism or Gnosticism, whatever you want to call it. And they were the original Paulinists. And there was this great strife between them and Ebionites, or law-observing Jewish Christians. And eventually, a good number of the Jewish Christians just died on the vine. Their product was too difficult to sell to a wider public who did not want to convert to Jewish cultic mores. But some joined with the Gentiles. The Gentiles had a more saleable product and quickly dominated the whole movement. Yet they kept the Old Testament, which was part of a compromise with Judaizing Catholicism. I mean, why did they keep it? They don't go to church on Saturday. They go on Sunday, and they say, we keep the 10 Commandments, but not the rest of Leviticus. So they got this love-hate relationship with it. So there was a kind of a compromise between the two wings, and the Christianity we know today is a result of that. So Paul did have everything to do with that. But I better pause for everybody to come up for air.
Cafe Brocado, thank you for your super sticker. Appreciate it. Can you expand more on why you think Simon Magus and Paul are the same person, and why were they later split up into two separate characters?
Well, I think, let me, as Nixon used to say, answer the second part of that question first. Assuming for the moment that Simon Magus and Paul were the same person, they get split as a result of this compromise with Jewish and Gentile / early Catholic Christianity. And each wanted to reconcile with the other. And like Jewish Christians said, this Paul you like so much, he persecuted us. And he put Jewish Christians to death and so on. I think that's a misunderstanding anyway. But the Gentile Christians said, well, your figurehead, Peter, this coward denied Jesus 3 times. That would buy you a ticket to the inferno, according to Jesus himself in the Gospels. This is your head honcho? Well, they had to kind of say, look, let's bury that hatchet and get together. Well, you had the same thing in the case of Paul. Gnostics all claim that Paul was the fountainhead of Gnosticism and Marcionism. But the Jewish Christians said Paul was like the Antichrist, a false prophet, and so forth. Well, what they did was to take the aspects of Paul that the Jewish Christians didn't like, and created and dumped that on Simon Magus as a kind of theological boogeyman and scapegoat. And once they had somewhat Judaized Paul to make him acceptable, they called him something else. Now, which was his original name? There's no way to know. But I'm guessing that what you had here was a division of this character, putting all the bad traits in someone's eyes on one and the good ones on the other. Now, why do I think they were originally the same guy? Well, there are a few avenues of approach to this. One is that, well, I guess the most important one is something that one of F.C. Bauer's students, Gustav Volkmar, came up with. He was reading Galatians, where I've just mentioned before, where Paul says he went to Jerusalem and to see if his gospel, his law-free gospel for Gentiles, was okay with the Jewish Christian pillars, presumably with the rest of the 12. And if he wouldn't have admitted he was wrong, but he hoped they would all agree and things would be, easy to get along by. And they said, well, yeah, that's all right if you preach that to the Gentiles, and Peter here will preach to the circumcision, our fellow Jews. But there is one proviso. You've got all of these congregations all over the Eastern Mediterranean. Suppose you collect charity from them to support us, the mother church. Now, if Acts is right and they had pooled all their income and established a socialist commune, you need look no further to wonder why they were poor all of a sudden. So they're trying to get Paul to start a GoFundMe for the Jerusalem church. And he says, I'll be happy to do that, which he does. And Volkmar's reading Acts, the story of Simon Magus, and he says, there's some deja vu going on here in the story of Simon Magus, who converts to Christianity and is baptized, along with the rest of the Samaritans, who were all baptized, but none of whom received the Holy Spirit. Now, how did he know they hadn't? Well, based on the other initiation stories in Acts, they must not have spoken in tongues, as the disciples of John, the household of Cornelius, and the apostles on Pentecost. So when Peter arrives and he lays hands on them, they do show whatever evidence, I think speaking in tongues, that they have received the Spirit. And Simon Magus approaches Peter and says, this is remarkable. I would like to be in on this. Can you enable me to do that? I'll gladly pay you for the privilege. And Peter repudiates him, and as J.B. Phillips translates it, says, to hell with you and your money. You thought you could buy the gift of God with money? And he says, you have neither part nor lot in this matter, or in this ministry, it's also translated. And so Volkmar said, wait a minute. This is kind of like when Paul agreed to pay tribute to Peter or Cephas, James and John and their church to get apostolic recognition, in effect to be declared an apostle. He was buying his way into it, to put it crudely. And Volkmar said, this just can't be a coincidence. And then, as Robert Eisenman pointed out, separate line of evidence, in Josephus, we read about certain people that were associated with Paul, namely King Agrippa, the two Roman procurators, Festus and Felix, and the wives of these guys, Bernice and Drusilla, were sisters. And one of their entourage was a magician named Simon. Well, those people are all named in Acts, and Paul is preaching to them. And Agrippa is the one that says, your great learning has driven you mad, Paul. In so short a time, you would have me be a Christian. He said, I only wish you were. and so on. Well, Eisenman said, that is interesting. This kind of sounds like Paul in Acts, but Josephus calls him Simon. Well, let's take a look at something else in Acts. This all fits together, believe it or not. When Paul and Barnabas go to, Cyprus, I think it is, right? And they meet a Roman official there, Sergius Paulus, and up to now, the apostle has been known as Saul, even in the beginning of the story. Well, Saul and Barnabas preach to Sergius Paulus, but he has an advisor who is a magician, sort of like Simon was to Agrippa and Felix and Festus and so forth, right? And he tries to persuade them, don't listen to this guy, some kind of crank. And Saul then says, why don't you shut up? Look, you're going to be blind for a few days to punish you till you stop perverting the straight paths of the Lord. That sounds like a kind of replay a la musical chairs of the story in Acts 9 and twice thereafter, where Paul is stopped in his tracks by a vision of the risen Christ, who recruits him to be a Christian and an apostle, right? And Paul is blinded. So it's like they've kind of split him up in that story between Sergius Paulus and the magician. What's the magician's name? Well, in various manuscripts of Acts, there's at least a couple of editions, the Western text and the Alexandrian. In some copies, he's called Elymas. In some, it's Etoimas or Etumas. Now, in some copies of Josephus, the hanger-on to Felix, Festus, Drusilla, Bernice, and Agrippa is called Etomas, and so it makes you think there's a basis for saying all these. Oh yeah, one other one I'll get to in a second is Bar Jesus. He's known as the son of Jesus. Of course, a common name, but wait and see. Sounds like it's Luke is just multiplying characters by splitting them up, redistributing what they do, and fooling around with the names. Okay, Bar Jesus, the son of Jesus. That brings us to Irenaeus. He, in his his adversus, whatever it is, against all heresies, he says that Simon Magus preached salvation by grace, not by works of the law, and preached that angels, not God, gave the law to Israel, which is what Galatians says, by the way. And he also claimed, Simon did, that he had lived in Judea previously and was crucified there, though it was docetic. He only seemed to suffer. And then he was now appearing as Simon. Well, that could be what Bar Jesus means, like a reincarnation of Jesus, a son of Jesus, a second coming of Jesus. And when you put all this stuff together, and there is yet more to it, it forms a strange puzzle, a kind of mosaic of tiles that fit amazingly together and form a coherent picture, namely that Simon Magus and Paul were the same character. And one last thing. In the Clementine literature, we have a scene where Peter is debating Simon Magus. And it's very obvious that what they're doing is to put Marcionite / Pauline theology in the mouth of Simon Magus. He is challenging Peter, saying, well, I'm an apostle too, you know. And Peter says, that's impossible. You never met Jesus in your life. We were with him. We know what he said. You're just making it up. And Simon says, no, I'm afraid you don't understand. There's no way you can be sure someone in an audience has correctly understood a speaker, as witness the Gospel of Mark. But if you have a revelation, it's like telepathy. You're getting it directly beamed into your brain. So I know what Jesus meant. I'm afraid you guys do not. Boy, that sounds an awful lot like Galatians again, right? I didn't get my gospel from any human being. I got it by direct revelation from the Lord. All of this stuff seems to fit together to me. And whereas little of it makes any sense by itself, it all interlocks. Now, let me say that with mythicism and with the identity of Simon and Paul, I admit these are simply hypotheses. They appeal to me, they make more sense than anything else, but I certainly cannot verify them. They're not dogmas that I promote. Oh, you ought to believe this. Nope. It just seems very cogent to me. So I do inform curious listeners about it. But as always, my task is simply to provide information and perspectives that my hearers may not already be familiar with. And of course, they're entitled to do with it whatever they see fit. So that's way more than you asked. I'm sorry to be such a big mouth, but there we go.
Oh, it's no problem at all. Can you expand on the relationship between Mark and Marcion?
Yeah, well, of course, we don't really know what the gospel authors were originally named, but it's certainly tempting to think that Mark is a reference to Marcion, whose name simply means little Mark. It's just a nickname version of Mark. And um, and according to Marcus, another one, Marcus Vincent, I find his model very convincing. Can't prove it, right? No time machine, but I find it compelling. He says that Marcion actually says that he was the first to write a Jesus narrative. And we know how Marcus Vincent thinks he did it, rewriting the narratives of the Septuagint. And that he was in charge of a school, a study group, of which there were several in Rome at the same time, Valentinus and a bunch of other ones. And he made copies of this first Jesus narrative and passed it out to his students saying, look, this is just for your perusal and we can discuss it. Do not show this to anybody else. It's just a draft. But these guys had never read anything like it. They thought it was terrific. And they said, look, I'm sorry. I can't help it. I've got to show this to people. They're going to love this. So they all did. And guess what happened? Soon there were popping up pirate editions of it as the different people who received a copy subtracted some stuff and added more or less of their own. This gets back to Marcion, who is pretty steamed. And he says they are forgers. But on the other hand, it wasn't all or nothing with him, just like with the Old Testament. And he said, I've got to admit, some of this stuff ain't bad. And so he set about doing a definitive version to be published, incorporating some of the stuff from the other Gospels and some of it. And then, of course, Tertullian is inadvertently attesting that later church leaders began to add and subtract from that. But that would explain a lot of things. And if Marcion wrote anything, it had to be, though, we usually think of Marcion's gospel as being a shorter version of what would become Luke. That's no doubt true, but I suspect that the approach to the 12 in Marcion's gospel was just like it is in Mark's, where they come in for a drubbing all the time, because remember, that was the chief hallmark of Marcion, that the disciples were numbskulls and dimwits, always rebuked and never commended by Jesus. So my guess is that that was part of the original, and so that a good hunk of Marcion's gospel owes its existence to Mark the evangelist, if that was his name. I mean, we don't even know that, right? But if it was, then I see a real connection.
Pravin Paul, thank you for your super chat. Why does Justin Martyr mention Simon but not Paul? How does your thesis Simon equals Paul explain this curious fact?
Well, actually, he kind of backs it up. He may have known the character simply as Simon. He may not have known. The reason he may. It may be the reason he never mentions Paul, and you're right, he doesn't, is that he only knows him as Simon. He doesn't quote any Pauline letters or anything like that. I'm guessing it still hasn't reached him that they've split the character in two. He didn't like the Simonians. He thought they were a real danger, and he apparently either understood that Paul is a fictive, you might say, positive caricature of Simon, or he may just not have heard that Simon was redeemable in the eyes of Catholic Christians.
Was there any gospel-like material at all, or even anything resembling it, before Marcion's gospel in your view? And my second part to that question is, what kind of Christian literature was there prior to Marcion's gospel?
There probably were collections of sayings. Again, that's very iffy. But on the one hand, we only read of isolated sayings here and there. And Justin, who refers to the memoirs of the apostles, again, only quotes sayings that seem like they're combinations of stuff from Matthew and Luke. Like supposedly Tatian, who harmonized the Gospels into the diatessaron of multiple Gospel crammed together from all four a bit later. Supposedly he was a disciple of Marcion, and so it's possible. No, I'm sorry, he's a disciple of Justin. I'm losing it. And that would fit, at least, with Justin's Jesus sayings being kind of part Matthew and part Luke. If his disciple Tatian had already sort of hybridized the two, but he doesn't give us any stories about Jesus.
So where did they get the idea of Jesus from? What is the Jesus character based upon?
I think he was a dying and rising Savior, and that was where Christian baptism and the Eucharist came from, the initiatory sacraments. And this must have been combined with Gnosticism, which, as Harnack said, was the origin of the idea that behind the earthly Jesus, there must have been a heavenly prototype. And because that's not necessarily in a mystery religion, but it's certainly vital to Gnosticism, and then, of course, in incarnational Catholicism, but also from the hero cult that we find in actual religions, like of Hercules. People were initiated into Hercules. They would don a lion's mane and go through some ritual that made them share in the victory of Hercules for salvation. But also, it looks like that the Greco-Roman romance stories had a role in this too. There were loads of these. We still have several of them that anyone can read in translation in a book called Collected Greek Romances, edited by B.P. Reardon from University of California at Berkeley Press. Very eye-opening. In these stories, we not every one of them, but there's at least 3 or 4 of them we know of, and with 2 we have the long, full texts. In these stories, there are star-crossed lovers where the woman seems to have died prematurely and is entombed. There, everybody's an aristocrat, like on soap operas on TV. So her tomb is filled with rich funerary tokens, like a pharaoh, and it's sealed. And tomb robbers have been watching it, waiting for it to be used because they knew it was an opulent tomb, and they said, "We got to get the crowbars out and get into that thing and collect all the gold and silk and everything in it." So they do, and wouldn't you know it, just as they're getting in there, the woman who was not dead but in a coma comes out of the swoon. And what are you doing here? What am I doing here? And the robbers say, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? I don't want to kill her. We can't have a witness, but we don't want to be tried for murder too. Let's take her along and sell her as a slave." Yeah, that's it. So they leave with her in tow. Shortly thereafter, her fiance or husband or whatever it is in each story comes to mourn at the grave and says, "Oh my gosh, it's open. What happened?" And he goes in there and she's not there. And her shroud is even folded up by itself. Others come to join him and say, "What the heck happened?" And the husband says, "Oh, she was so beautiful. The gods were jealous of me and they've taken her up to be with them." But then somebody realizes what happened. Oh boy, she must have been kidnapped. And so the husband, fiance, whatever, goes through this picaresque journey all over the empire looking for her. Have you seen her? Oh yeah, and went that away, and so on. In the meantime, she's come to the attention of some governor or king who says, I got to have this woman as my wife. And so he marries her. And just about that time, the husband catches up with him and says, "Hey, she's my wife. You can't marry her." "Oh, yeah, we'll see about that, buddy." And so the governor or king sentences the husband to crucifixion. And he is tied or nailed to the cross, but survives it in one way or another. And then eventually the two meet up again, and at first each thinks the other is a ghost. "I can't believe you're really alive," and they have a joyous reunion and so forth. Does that ring a familiar bell? Premature burials, empty tombs, people being crucified by the government yet surviving it, a joyous reunion scene that is as if the dead had come back. Uh, who the heck knows? I mean, we know that early Christian stories of women becoming virginal nuns and evangelists, like Thecla, for instance, they are partly based on the Greco-Roman romance novels, but it looks like that the Gospels have a good element of that in it too. So as with all things, you've got different streams flowing together. And it seems to me with those factors, you don't really need much else to explain it. And of course, the result is great stuff. I don't like to give the impression, though I know it's inevitable to begin with, that I'm trying to debunk or degrade or condemn the Gospels. Far from it. I love this stuff. It's very edifying, and there's a lot of good stuff to learn and to live out. So I'm just saying, to me, I'm interested in historical method, and I want to use that to understand these texts, which I love as well as I can. And eventually that led me to the point where I had to put away childish things and no longer regard it as inerrant and infallible scripture. And I don't think I've lost anything.
Where did Marcion get his information for his gospel from? Did he have other sources? Did he make up most of what he wrote in the gospel? What do you think happened there?
Well, most of it, I think, the Jesus narrative is based on the Old Testament. I did a research project, 25, maybe 30 years ago now. It's hard to believe, where I found every book I could where the author compared Gospel and Acts material with Old Testament material. John Dominic Crossan's Who Killed Jesus, for instance, is one of those. Randall Helms's book, Gospel Fictions, was probably the first of those I read. Thomas L. Brody wrote a bunch of books showing how that the gospel writers must have rewritten a lot of the Deuteronomic history, especially about Elijah and Elisha, into gospel stories, a minute, detailed comparison. And when I was done, there were many more of these. In fact, you can read the results in my book, The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems. The biggest section in it is where I put side by side the gospel passage and the Old Testament passage, and comment on the similarities. When I was done, though, I set aside some of the comparisons and supposed parallels as unconvincing. I didn't think they were all cogent, but I did find that virtually every narrative passage in the Gospels, and mostly in Acts too, did convincingly seem to be based on Old Testament material. And that's really what pushed me over the edge into mythicism. If there was a historical Jesus, did no one remember anything he actually said or did? Did you have to make up the whole darn thing from scripture? That seems very strange to me. And it seems to imply that, yeah, it was a rewrite of well-known scripture.
Do you see Marcion's gospel as being very similar to the Q source?
Well, that throws that whole thing into a cocked hat, as they say, because as Vincent shows, that you have to posit several different layers of one redactor changing the work of another. And this means that these layers represent different redactions by people that got a hold of Marcion's original, what they added, what Marcion then added or subtracted there, stuff that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whoever they actually were, had added, whatever changes they suffered by other redactors. I don't know that anyone can trace it, but the recent work of Dennis MacDonald, I think, offers the beginnings of a key to doing that, because he sort of lays aside, as I understand it, classic source criticism and says it must be a lot more complicated than that. So rather than blocking it off into sources, let's just compare the different versions of a saying and see which one appears more primitive, regardless of which gospel it now appears in, and regardless of the hypothetical order or relationship between those gospels. It's very complex, and I have yet really to start grappling with it. But I think I think that kind of work is really changing the whole face of source and redaction criticism on us. And Marcion fits right into that, makes it all the more complicated.
Solera Knight, thank you for your super chat. Has the belief in a god per se in minds of humans helped or harmed true peace on earth? Is there any god outside the mind of humans within nature?
I doubt it. And I look at the wonders of the world. Uh, my favorite example is reproduction. That that if you stand back and don't take it for granted anymore, and you say, wait a minute, you mean new members of the species emerge from the physical bodies of the previous generation? You're kidding. The stork seems more plausible than that. Yet that is the truth. Or everything, different life forms, the weather, the system of the planets. Why is any of this here? It does make me think I really don't know much. When Protagoras said man is the measure of all things, of the things that are, that they are, of the things that are not, that they're not. I turn that around. I think he was a little too confident. Maybe we can only bet on what we can figure out. Maybe that's what he meant. But most of what we see doesn't fall into that category. So, was there a great cosmic designer? It almost seems like there has to be, but then where did he or it or she come from? I give up. I just approach the world in wonder, not worship, but wonder. I don't know how it got here, who, if anybody, did put it here. So I don't know what to make of there being an actual, objectively real God out there. But the God everybody talks about, the one we meet in mythology and in the Bible and in personal religious experience, excuse me, it seems to me, yeah, that's just in your head. If anything, it's probably specifically in your temporal parietal lobe, from whence mystical experiences come. And because when people say, oh, God is guiding us on this and that, really, can't you see what you're saying? And God's healed me. Why didn't he heal anybody else? So it makes you special. You're really just saying, wow, I was lucky. So I tend not to take the God people think they have a piece of seriously, though in a way they do have a piece of them. I think it's just a function of the will to believe. It's an interpretive paradigm, you might say, but people don't think that's all it is, and I think they're wrong. Don't want to give them trouble for it because they're probably better off with that. I take a Gnostic approach to a lot of these things. I don't want to rock the boat of people whose beliefs I think are childishly simplistic because it does get them through the night. They're not ready for what I think. They would think that all is lost if I said, "Hey, let me sit you down and tell you why I don't believe in this and that." That's none of my business. But so I think, in a way, yes, it is good. It's a security blanket. It's an inspiration. Many people do many good things because they seem to hear the voice of God or Christ admonishing them. That's good. I'm not complaining. I guess it's like what a Buddhist abbot said to Ronald Iyer on the old PBS show, The Long Search. The interviewer asked this Zen master, "Is the Buddha real or not?" And the abbot said, "Well, for those who need him to exist, he exists. For those who don't need him to exist, he doesn't." Well, you can't really get beyond that. I guess I would say that's the way it is. I respect whatever it is anybody believes, unless they're a Charles Manson follower or a jihadi or something.
What do you make of the relationship between Marcion's gospel and the hypothetical Lucas or Proto-Luke?
Well, it's possible that they're the same thing, but that makes the most sense, or perhaps any sense, only if you take the simpler model that Marcion began as, so to speak, a shorter Luke, and Luke added to it. But if it was complicated, like Marcus Vincent said, that's not that helpful anymore, because a lot of the distinctively Lucan stuff um, appears in no other gospel. All these long parables, they're only in Luke. I would say that somebody has added that, and I don't believe they appeared in Marcion's gospel according to church fathers' citations of what was and wasn't. I have to double check that. But I think now it's the way it's gotten so messed up, so complex, it's that isn't that meaningful anymore.
Can you tell us about like what Marcion's gospel looked like? There are different reconstructions of it out there. What are the problems with reconstructing the text?
Well, luckily, there are so many reviews of it by Tertullian and others where they say, hey, look, he doesn't have this. He must have cut it out. He doesn't have that. He must have chopped that. Well, that tells us a lot. And the question becomes, as Tertullian admitted, did we Catholics add the stuff or did he cut it out? And he said, they accuse me, I accuse them. Can't really prove it. What would have been in Marcion's gospel? Given the overt Marcionism of so much of John and Mark, it seems to me that either Marcion's students or he himself must have put that into their versions of his draft, and who knows how much of it survived into his final draft, or was it added by later, more Catholic redactors? I'm too confused now by the wealth of detail in these theories. It's hard for me to say anymore. I mean, I did a hypothetical reconstruction of it in my pre-Nicene New Testament, but that was before I learned about all these theories that have kind of thrown that aside.
What would you say your views are now compared to what they were when you wrote the pre-Nicene New Testament?
Pretty much the same. I guess that would be the one thing I would change, because I think I've like with the gospel according to the Hebrews, that we can kind of reconstruct the same way when Jerome and others say, oh, what do you know, the Hebrew gospel had this a little differently. Not a woman taken in adultery, but a woman guilty of many sins. Or different details with the Jordan baptism. I think there it's a much simpler matter, though again, not quite so simple, since were the gospel according to the Hebrews, according to the Nazarenes, and according to the Ebionites, different drafts of the same basic work? Or were they different Jewish Christian gospels? We ain't got them, so we don't really know. But based on what we do have, I would say I'd probably stick with what I did there. Let's see. Yeah, I would stick by just about everything else I said. I've since read something about the Epistle of Barnabas, a factor about something about an anachronism, possibly given a mention of Hadrian rebuilding the temple. I forget what it is offhand. I might have made a change there, but on the whole, it's still my accumulated view over these decades.
So now I want to ask you about the relationship between Marcion's gospel and canonical Luke. Why do you think canonical Luke seems to preserve more of the exact wording of Marcion's gospel, assuming it used Marcion's gospel and not the reverse, in comparison and contrast to Mark, and Matthew, and later John?
Well, say the beginning of the question again about the similarity between Luke and Marcion.
In other words, why does Luke seem to preserve the exact wording of Marcion's gospel better than Mark, Matthew, and John did?
Well, I guess the stuff he wanted to add didn't require rewording much. For instance, with the pretty obviously Marcionite parables of the patch on the cloth and the new wine, old wineskins. I mean, that certainly seems Marcionite. What did Luke do? He just adds a contradiction right onto the end of it. But there are people that say, I don't bother with the new wine. The old wine is the good stuff. That is obviously an anti-Marcionite contradiction. I don't listen to what he said there. Or Marcion minimizing any link with the Old Testament. How did Luke deal with that? Well, he added the first couple of chapters, which sound like they're from the Old Testament because they're based on First Samuel, etc. Right? So if he did that kind of thing, he didn't need necessarily to change much. Like there's nothing in the Sermon on the Mount that he needed to change, though this gets into whether he and Matthew independently used Q, each of which had some version of the sermon, but he doesn't really change that much. He does subtract and some beatitudes and add some woes, but it's not all that different. Like Matthew has blessed are the poor in spirit, Luke has blessed are the poor. Which is more original? They still debate it. Oh boy, that is really tough to say. And so much of it, like the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the Pharisee and the publican, the unjust judge, etc., is only in Luke. So we can't tell. That's the only version we have of huge portions of Luke. Let's see. Like the resurrection, I don't know if we have any idea what the resurrection of Jesus would have been like, but he sure wouldn't, in Marcion, he sure would not be saying, touch my hands and feet, and no spirit has flesh and bones as you see that I have. That Marcion wouldn't have said that. But did Luke reword something or just added something extra, it seems to me. The passion narrative, there's a lot of uniquely Lucan material in that looks like it's sort of been interspersed with Markan material. But that'd be my general feeling, that on the whole, where he does overlap or have adjacent differences from Marcion, it's simply because he's added material that Marcion wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole.
Solara Knight, thank you for another super chat. Did Paul and Constantine see the same similar made-up vision? Can the Constantine cross also be a symbol of a sword, both persecutors?
Well, yeah, there are 4 versions of Constantine's vision, 2 of them in pagan authors, 2 in Christian authors, one, I guess, Eusebius, the other Lactantius, I think. And in one, I don't think it's the Cairo monogram that he sees. I forget what it is he does see. In the 2 Christian ones, this is how he becomes a Christian, but in the non-Christian ones, it isn't. He's just given whatever image it is, whatever diagram or whatever monogram it is, and told to paint this on your men's shields and you will conquer. So we don't really know. In fact, there's some reason to think Constantine was raised a Christian. He didn't get converted at all. I don't happen to be familiar with the debate, but I did read one book where the guy argued that, yeah, he was already a Christian. And in fact, he was kind of a weird Christian in the end anyway, because though he was really a Christian, he convened the Council of Nicaea and so forth. He had his favorite Christology and all that. He was also the Pontifex Maximus of Sol Invictus, the cult of the invincible sun, S-U-N. What was this guy thinking? This wasn't Orthodox Christianity for sure. So I don't know, but I think the Milvian Bridge vision may not have been the conversion, may not have marked the conversion of Constantine, and I'm not even sure why it would, even if it's described correctly by Eusebius and Lactantius. It wouldn't, from what they say, the voice said, that's not like from now on you're going to be believing in me. So I don't know.
How does Marcion priority really change the game when you look at the four canonical gospels? What does it do differently from the standard view of the two-source theory?
Well, it screws it up in that it becomes almost untraceably complicated. If Marcus Vincent is right, that you start out with the original Marcionite draft gospel, and then his students begin to add to it. And then the people they gave copies of that to probably begin to add to it and rewrite it. And some or all of that material goes back to Marcion, who then incorporates some of the new stuff and cuts some stuff, possibly some of what he had originally written, and then publishes the result. And then did anybody change any of it after that? There's no way to tell. So I think it becomes virtually impossible to do the old source critical number. At least I don't yet see how. You're going to have to be a lot smarter than me but since you are, you might be able to do it.
So now I want to ask you about the Q source. Do you believe that the Q source existed, and did it predate Marcion's gospel, or is it after Marcion's gospel? One of the reasons I ask you this question is because I think you did tell me that you believe it existed a while back. And so my question is, not all of the Q material appears in Marcion's gospel. So is Q adding to what Marcion's gospel lacked in the double tradition material, or is Marcion subtracting?
Well, I'm guessing it does seem to me pretty likely that there was one. And what convinces me was something in Bart and Mac's book on Q, where he says if you agree with subdividing Q into Qs 1, 2, and 3, different strata, the first one being capital C, cynic in flavor and orientation, not overtly Christian, then he says, then you can see that it naturally falls into 7 subsections divided topically, and that seems like too much to be coincidence. He said that establishes his opinion that the historical Jesus was a kind of a cynic, whether he used the word or not, but like Diogenes and others. That convinced G.A. Wells, the great standard bearer of mythicism for a long time in the late 20th century, that convinced him, okay, I was wrong. There must have been a historical Jesus, much like Mac describes. But he jumped the gun, because how did Mac demonstrate the cynical voice of this material? Well, by showing parallels with the surviving writings of other cynics, Demonax, Meleager, Diogenes, and so on. In other words, his argument shows that that whoever wrote this, maybe more, who's ever being quoted, I should say, they were all cynics. It doesn't prove that a single man came up with it. So I differ from Mack and Wells on that one. But I do find Mack pretty convincing in terms of, yeah, Q1 seems like a cynic document. And who was the big cynic? Diogenes of Sinope. Where was Marcion from? Sinope. Both were ascetics. So it wouldn't be too surprising if he did draw upon Q1 in writing his gospel. It would make plenty of sense.
So you think, in other words, the larger Q that Matthew and Luke used is post Marcion and is embellishing earlier versions of Q, and Marcion's gospel would count as kind of like a middleman. Maybe you can call him Q2 or even Q Luke.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Do you think that Matthew and Luke used the other, or do you think the two of them are independent of one another?
I used to think they were independent, but I read something just recently that made me think maybe Matthew used Mark and Luke used Matthew and Mark. But it may be that Marcus Vincent's model even disrupts that. I got to put the old thinking cap on instead of the Stupanatron helmet that I'm wearing at the moment. I mean, if it weren't for the Vincent view, I might go along with that one, but it's really difficult. Like Dennis MacDonald's view, finding more primitive sounding versions of parallel sayings inconsistently in different gospels we thought were earlier and later. Oh man, that complicates too. Oh boy, it ain't so easy. I guess it never was, but it's worse now.
What do you make of the similar hypothesis that there are problems with saying that Luke knew Marcion's gospel or Marcion's gospel knew Luke? And so instead, it posits the idea that they both used a proto-Luke as a common source.
I'd really have to do a lot of close comparison. It doesn't sound outlandish. I guess it would depend on, like, if you saw what appeared to be redaction or a certain type of distinctive usage of what we think of as proto-Luke that stops with other Luke, canonical Luke parallels. If you no longer saw the specific kind of changes you did to the proto-Luke material, that would be a pretty good reason to think that that Marcion used only proto-Luke. Or was it the other way around? I'm beginning to get foggy here. Oh boy.
So now I want to shift to Paul's letters. When were they created? Were they created before Marcion's gospel, after Marcion's gospel, or what?
Ooh. I suspect before, because otherwise you'd have the old problem of why do the epistles not quote the gospels? Because there are plenty of times that gospel material would have come in handy. So mythicists typically say, well, that's because the Gospels hadn't been written yet. Those sayings hadn't been coined yet. They couldn't have come to Paul's or the attention of the authors of the epistles. Well, and by the same token, I would guess that the epistles were written first by Marcion and his circle, and others interested, some Gnostics, and then later the Gospels were written, possibly picking up material from like Romans 12, which has a bunch of maxims that sort of sound like they would be in the Gospels, but they aren't. But that's just a guess. Somebody out there probably has a good counter to that. But from what I've thought through on it, I would say probably the Marcionites. And I would think that they were put together along the same lines that the Gospels were, that there was probably an early Marcionite draft of several of the letters, maybe the four Hauptbriefe that Bauer thought were the only authentic Pauline epistles. Maybe they were in some form the original Marcionite epistles, but that then people began to imitate them and to add and subtract with the original ones. And they made the rounds and kept getting redacted, because I agree with Van Manen that, as if I'm doing him a favor, another great mind, this guy, that the epistles appear to be patchwork quilts. There's a shocking lack of continuity or logic in them. They, like in First Corinthians, it seems like every chapter contradicts the one before it. What's this? Well, it makes the most sense to me that some Paulinist reading this didn't happen to agree on this or that particular topic and the way it was dealt with, and decided, well, I don't have the right to just chop this stuff, but I think I'm going to put it in an alternate view. And I think that almost has to have happened. And that may be the same way that the Gospel of Marcion made the rounds and started collecting barnacles by other people. I'm beginning to get pretty beat. I think I'm going to have to retire for the evening pretty soon.
Yeah, I just have like one or two more
Oh,
questions,
great.
and then I'll end the stream. So another question I have about Paul's letters is, you just said that Marcion and his group wrote Paul's letters, and you're referring to the Apostolicon, his version of Paul's letters, because there's also canonical Paul, obviously, which you would say was a later embellishment of the Marcionite edition.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I think, yeah. And then
So
beyond that, of course, you got the pastorals, and then these other oddball things like the short Laodiceans, Alexandrians, Third Corinthians, and so on. And the letters between Paul and Seneca. I don't want to leave those out.
Oh, yes. So my question is this. Do you think Marcion decided to write his gospel, or that somebody else wrote that gospel after Marcion composed the Apostolicon?
Well, I think that Marcion was the original evangelist because of the quotes from him that Marcus Vincent dug up, quoting heresiologists, I guess, and those references. Marcion referred to the canonical gospel writers as forgers and all that. I would think that he was the original author of the first gospel, and then probably was the original author of at least the four principal epistles, and that others began to add to them, and then to add other epistles that showed a different framework. Like I was just reading F.C. Bauer, on his lectures on New Testament theology, and well, it's common knowledge now among scholars, but that Ephesians and Colossians, well, one of those is a rewrite of the other already, but they have a whole different, more cosmic framework, like the church, the mystical body of Christ. You don't have that in Galatians, Corinthians, Romans. The church there is always the local congregation, and there's more about the pre-existent nature of Christ and so on. It's like headed toward Johannine writing, and but that had Marcionite connections too, so that's no surprise. So I know I'm trailing off here, but I think that, yeah, he would have been the first gospel writer and the original epistle writer. But even within the Marcionite churches, there would have been room for adding new Marcionite epistles, new Pauline epistles, and adding stuff to the old ones, and still making it the Apostolicon by the time the apologists are reading something that corresponded to our Pauline canon, but criticized Marcion's version.
So we got another super chat question. Solara Knight, thank you for another super chat. Hebrew names like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel become English names, Luke, John, Mark in New Testament?
Well, let's see. I think, what does Isaiah be? Isaias, I think Isaiah becomes. Jeremias, I think, very little change there. Ezekiel becomes, that's the same as Hezekiah. I'm not sure what that becomes in Greek. Luke, I don't think corresponds to a Hebrew name. I could be wrong. I don't know Hebrew. John, of course, is short for a Hebrew name, Yohanan, the gift of Yahweh. And Mark, again, that seems to be a purely Latin name in all of its forms: Marcus, Marcos, Mark, etc., and Marcion. Jacob, Jacob becomes James ultimately, and so forth. So yeah, you had different, and sometimes Hebrew names were simply substituted with Greek names that sounded kind of similar, but strictly speaking were not Greek counterparts. Like some guys named Yeshua would call themselves Jason, others Jesus, like we get the impression Jesus would have done. Who else? Peter. Actually, there was, I believe I've heard, though this sounds Greek, but I know I read that there was an Aramaic named Petros, but that somehow the scholar claimed to know that Peter was really simply a translation of Cephas, though others have said Peter and Cephas were different guys. Oh boy, what a mess. Or Bartholomew. That's an anglicization of Bartholomew, which has a Hebrew or an Aramaic prefix, bar, son of, and then Ptolemy, like the Ptolemaic emperors, because there were loads of Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt. Boy, there's a lot of a real mixed bag. It's fascinating.
So for my last question, when you look at the early church fathers, I'm talking like pre-Justin Martyr, apostolic fathers, their era, do they seem generally unaware of Paul when you look at them? When you look at not just Justin Martyr, but Papias and other ones that were coterminous, contemporary with him, just seem massively ignorant of Paul.
Well, we don't have enough of Papias to be sure. It's just a bunch of fragments. Justin, again, never mentions him. I think Irenaeus does, certainly, but that's later than the Apostolic Fathers. I believe, well, Clement does, take up the letter of Paul to you, and believe Polycarp does. Does Ignatius? I've read him a bunch of times, and I cannot remember.
I'm pretty sure he does. I'll replace it with a two-parter question, and then we'll close. The first part to that question is, when do you think canonical Paul was created? And the second part to that question is, when do you think First Clement was written?
I suspect Clement had to be written fairly late in the 2nd century, because I think that it's anonymous, for one thing. There's no name on it. It's not even pseudonymous. But it refers to Peter and Paul being martyred out of jealousy. Well, to me, that bespeaks the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, which were all encretite works in which the apostles are preachers of the encretite gospel of celibacy. And this so infuriated the husbands or fiancés of women disciples who embraced this gospel and slammed the bedroom door on hubby, that they went to complain about Paul to governors and kings and said, this guy's a charlatan and a gigolo. He's a homewrecker. Can't you do something about it? And so the king or governor or whatever did have him arrested and executed. In all 5 of the major apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, it was husbandly jealousy that got the apostles executed. To me, that makes by far the most sense, and that place is First Clement, pretty darn late. And it's so long. It's not really a letter. It's not even an epistle. It's 60 chapters. And it just seems to me, maybe some part of it was earlier, but they kept adding on to it. And so I don't venerate it as that early a document as some do. And Ignatius's epistles, probably decades after they're supposed to have been written, they all seem to be apocryphal. What a mess. Poor Westcott, Hort, and those guys who thought in the Apostolic Fathers they had a check on church history evolving in the New Testament period. Tough luck, guys.
Now, what about my other part to that question? When do you think canonical Paul was created?
I think probably in the 90s, because of retrospective passages that seem to go back further than our usual dates for Paul, and the fact that we have no definitive information on when he lived or died. And it seems to me it's post 70 because of First Thessalonians, which I do not think is interpolated, because the wrath of God has come on them at last, but also in the Epistle to the Romans, let their table, their altar, become a stumbling block for them, and so forth. That by Paul's epistles, especially Romans, it's become clear that Jews have wholesale rejected Christianity. That can't have happened very soon. So it seems to me it probably the canonical Paul is around the end of the 1st century.
Well, that actually does get me to ask you one extra question, because you said earlier that Marcion created Paul's letters. So did he, in his Apostolicon, did he abridge canonical Paul, or did he have an earlier form of Paul's letters at that canonical Paul at the end of the 1st century embellished?
Good question. I don't really know. It's quite possible there are fragments of Pauline letters, but that gets me to wondering if Nina Livesey is right and that Paul was a fiction. I mean, I don't think so, because I think this is more evidence that he was Simon Magus. But then if he was the only actual Paul, when was he around? That would also fit being very late in the 1st century. So I really have little basis for answering, at least so far as I've thought about it.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and close. I'd like to remind everybody that the links to purchase Bob's books will be in the description below and in the pinned comment, and also the link to the GoFundMe as well. And that being said, Bob, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always. Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.